thank you so much for joining us here tonight and for the event Curing HIV, Only a Start. I'm going to do a very brief welcome, and then we're going to kick our program off. So I want to thank a couple people. Rich DeQuilla of Northwestern University has made this whole thing possible, so thank you, Rich, and thank you for bringing our featured speaker, Timothy Ray Brown, to town. We are very, very excited to have you. And your being here has made some great things possible. We were on Chicago Tonight last night, and I was talking to some folks today who were talking about the show in their taxi ride, and the cab driver said, "Oh, the Delta CCR5 blah 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 mutation," and he knew, he had watched the show and memorized whatever the mutation is that Timothy got. So it's really amazing how the information has been soaked up by people. I also want to thank CDPH, and you'll be hearing from Commissioner Choucair in a minute, but they have made us using this space possible, and also thank Freshie, which will be providing some refreshments for after the event. And finally, I want to thank Cortney Hall of WGN-TV Morning News, who's going to be our moderator tonight, and she's staying up late for us, so thank you so much, Cortney, and welcome everybody.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, John.
Well, tonight we are here as one city with one purpose, talking about a cure to end HIV. The virus has taken the lives of 36 million friends and family members since 1981. That's worldwide. And 1.6 million individuals since 2012 alone. Now, according to the HIV-STI surveillance report produced in December by the Chicago Department of Public Health, more than 21,000 people in Chicago report living with HIV. Now, here's the thing. 1 in 5 people don't even know they have HIV, so that number is likely higher. Every one of those individuals has a story. We will hear some of those stories tonight. It will be inspiring. But before we're going to hear from that, we're going to hear from 2 experts on HIV's impacts in the realms of public health and science. First, I would like to introduce Bechara Choucair, who serves as the Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Public Health, appointed in November of 2009. Dr. Choucair is reshaping the department to meet the public health challenges of the 21st century. He's unveiled Healthy Chicago, the first citywide comprehensive public health agenda, and under his leadership, the Chicago Department of Public Health became the first big city public health agency to receive national accreditation. Please welcome Dr. Bechara Choucair.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see so many people coming here tonight to share with us this exciting evening. Thank you for the folks who work on putting this together. This is an exciting evening for all of us. I want to start on behalf of all of us at the Health Department by welcoming you and really sharing with you how important the work that everyone here is doing is for our city, for our residents, and for our communities. When we started talking about HIV 30 years ago or so, everybody was so scared of HIV and not knowing what to do. And now what we're seeing is really good progress. We have seen declines in number of new cases of HIV year after year for the last 10 or so years. We've seen declines by 5% of new cases of AIDS every year. We've seen every one of our subpopulations rates of HIV go down when it comes to new cases. And the number of people living with HIV is going higher because now we have good treatments and people are staying in care and getting good care. So the story, when you look at the numbers, is looking good, and we're very, very excited about that. We've seen less new cases of women with HIV. We've seen the rates go down for people who are using IV drugs and others. So we're seeing some really good trends. And our report that we've issued earlier in December tells the story. But the numbers are also telling us a story that's not as good. We know that young people, especially young men who have sex with men, the rates of new cases continues to go up year after year since 2007. And that's why we're partnering with so many of the folks here at the event with the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, Northwestern, folks from U of C, and others to really try to see what can we do to make a difference specifically for this population where the rates are still going up. You know, and the other thing that we've been talking about a lot is this continuum of care, and I'm happy to share with you 3 numbers today that are very, very important. So when we want to make sure that we're making sure that people who have HIV are connected to care, and I'm happy to share with you that in 2010, 78% of people who were diagnosed with HIV in 2010 were linked to care in the first 3 months after diagnosis. So this is a good story there. Another number I want to share with you is 51% of those who were diagnosed with HIV in 2010 were retained in care. So we engage 78%, we connect them to care, but only 51% of those are retained in care. So while really our goal is to get that number to 100%, this is still 51% better than the 37% number that we see nationally. So we continue to do a good job at engaging people, but we still have a longer way to go in retaining people in care. And the other good number that I'm going to share with you is we know that once we're retaining people in care, once people living with HIV are taking their medication, we're achieving an 87% viral suppression. And this is extremely important to making sure that people living with HIV are getting treated and they're living longer and living healthier lives, but also we're limiting the spread of HIV in the community. So those 3 numbers are really important, and they tell a good story from that report that we issued in December of this year. We still have a long way to go. This is why events like today, partners like those who are here tonight, are really great to help us keep the needle moving in the right direction. This is why our community engagement through the Chicago Area HIV Service Council, or CAHIS, has been a great partner to us in helping us think on how we invest in HIV care and STI prevention, and we're really excited to be partnering with them. But really, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that every one of those folks who are living with HIV in our city are getting the best care they can. They're getting connected to care, they're getting the care that they deserve, and most importantly, they're living healthier, longer lifestyles. And then eventually, we want to get to a point where we could replicate Timothy Ray Brown's story, where we are living in an HIV-free world, where we can cure HIV. And we can't do that without everybody's efforts, without people on the ground educating folks to preventing them from getting HIV at the first place, folks engaging people with HIV, linking them to care, but also our research and scientific and medical community working on new innovative way to curing HIV. I know you will all be so inspired as I was when I read Timothy's story, and I'm sure it's be equally as inspirational today. So thank you, Timothy, for joining us tonight. Thank you to the AIDS Foundation for hosting us, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. And I shouldn't end without thanking all of our HIV folks from the health department, from the HIV team. If you raise your hand, if you have any questions for any of us, please make sure you also chat with them. I see Nick, I see Deborah, I see Nanette, I see Ya. They're all here to serve you. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
All right, in response to Dr. Choucair's comments, we are going to talk about some of that local research in helping to monitor the evolution of HIV over the years. I'm going to introduce Dr. Richard D'Aquila of the Howard Taylor Rickards Professor of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases of the Department of Medicine at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. A little bit about him. He's the founding director of the Northwestern HIV Translational Research Center, which began in August of 2012. The center works to innovate cross-disciplinary collaborative approaches to HIV prevention and care. Dr. D'Aquila studied biology at Yale College, receiving his MD degree at the Albert Einstein School of Medicine, and did his medical residency at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania and fellowship in infectious diseases and molecular virology at Yale Medical School, then moving to the Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. In the 1990s, he helped develop some of the breakthrough 3-drug combinations against HIV. He later led international collaborative efforts to develop antiretroviral resistance testing, which is now an essential tool for personalizing HIV medicine. His laboratory here in Chicago is now working to develop medicines for treatment strategies to boost these defenses as an approach to attempting to be able to control HIV in every infected person with medication taken for only a few years instead of a lifetime. That's just amazing. Please help me welcome Dr. Choucair.
Thank you so much, Cortney, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I hope you all picked up a handout on your way in, and I have to start by giving some credit to the many organizations that have participated in planning Timothy Brown's visit to Chicago to celebrate the 7th anniversary of his cure. This collaborative group is really spearheaded by the Chicago Department of Public Health and the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, as well as some very strong collaborators that I'm really pleased to work with at Northwestern, the Impact LGBT Health and Development Program at Northwestern. We also have a variety of other groups, including the Center for HIV Elimination at the University of Chicago, the Center on Halsted, the Howard Brown Health Center, Chicago House, Vita CETA, Brothers Health Collective, TPAN, UIC, Loyola, and of course the Timothy Ray Brown Foundation of the World AIDS Institute. And this is indeed only the start for our group. We will be meeting in the future after Timothy's visit ends to try to work together to come up with new ways to deal with today's problems and continue the progress that you heard Dr. Choucair describe. We want to slow and stop the HIV epidemic, and we want to prioritize dealing with the problems we have now among our young people. We would love for HIV to go the way of smallpox, wipe it off the face of the planet. That's not going to happen soon, but we have to use every possible way to get there. And that means awareness, that means condoms, that means all the medicines that we have available now and more that hopefully will come in the future. Other things that are still under research like vaccines, microbicides, and yes, the possibility of curing HIV. Tonight is really about how one man, Mr. Brown, inspired a ton of new research. Scientists 6 or 7 years ago said it wasn't possible to cure HIV. We couldn't use the word cure and the term HIV in the same sentence without being laughed out of the room. But we've now learned it is in fact possible. And the title for tonight, Only the Start, really refers to the fact that Mr. Brown is only the first out of those 36 million people now living with HIV who's been cured. We want more people to join him. So before I let him talk, I want to tell you a little bit about my world and my experience. First off, I want you to know 2 facts that I think are really, really important tonight. And I'm not sure many people are aware of these facts. And I'm going to tell you these things from a personal perspective, really from 2 perspectives. As a physician who's been working on infections, and in particular HIV, since 1982. And you know, I have the privilege now of leading this center that's dedicated to making new discoveries about HIV prevention and cure and trying to move them from the lab into the real world. But in 1982, when I decided to be an infection doctor, we didn't have AIDS. The reason I was attracted to infections was because we could give people antibiotics for 2 weeks and they'd get all better. I really didn't want to take care of people who were going to die. I was very much unattracted to taking care of cancer. I wanted to take care of things that would be more rewarding, and quicker. But 1982 was the first year we started seeing cases of what later became known as AIDS, and still later turned out to be caused by this virus called HIV. For several years, what I did as a doctor was help people die and attended funerals. And I'll never forget those days. And those days really motivated me to move back into research and to try my best with a lot of teamwork to do something about the problem. I was lucky enough to have been involved in some very important drug development and other advances, and I really hope to, here in Chicago with our team, continue that. So I have an insider's view of the problems that remain. And of course, we've made amazing progress. But the first fact that I want to tell you is, I think, best exemplified by this article that was in the New York Times in 2008, and it's still true. People who are doing well on HIV medicines and have no sign of HIV in their blood can still have major problems from what we call premature aging. This means that they can develop things like heart attacks at an earlier age. And the medicines that work so well that were developed in the mid-90s really keep people from dying in a few years, but they don't prevent these longer-term complications. And these medicines, I think, should be thought of like insulin for diabetes. They control the problem, but they don't get rid of it. You have to take these medicines every single day for the rest of your life, and that's really hard. And those medicines work to keep the virus down, but they don't knock it out. And the body still is working overtime trying to fight off this virus, using every resource it can to do that, but the virus has sort of disabled the strongest defenses we have, so the body keeps working without any effective action. And that's why the heart and other organs tend to wear out earlier than they should, because they're exhausting themselves. The immune system is exhausting itself. The second fact that I want you to know about, and this is where my being a parent comes in, the number of new cases of HIV in the US is staying about the same. We want to see that go down to 0. But as you've already heard, the number of new cases in some groups, particularly among older people, has been going down. We've been very effective there. But where we have not been effective and where we've seen increases in recent years is among the young. Young people are now at greatest risk, and this is predominantly in Chicago and most other cities, young gay men. 60% of the young people who are getting HIV in recent years are African American gay men, and the risk is greatest in certain neighborhoods. This is a figure from that December 2013 HIV surveillance report from CDPH, and darker colors are bad. Darker colors on this map indicate higher numbers of new HIV diagnoses per 100,000 people, and those numbers, you can't read them, but they're as bad as anywhere in the US, including places like southern Florida, Louisiana, where we know the epidemic is really the worst. And these numbers approach what we see in Africa in terms of the numbers of new cases. Now, that's specifically in those neighborhoods that are colored darkly on this map. And the worry I have, and the worry I think all parents hearing these facts will have, is what's going to happen if a 20-year-old starts on these HIV medicines? Are they going to start having heart attacks in their 40s and 50s? And the young think they're immortal, but parents know a little bit different perspective. And I've been with teens and young adults up close and personal, and I find these numbers very troubling, and I want us all to work together to do whatever we can to change these numbers. Now, we think that if we can knock the virus out completely, that is, cure the infection, the body will not exhaust itself continually trying to ineffectively fight off the virus. And we think this is a way to stop that problem of premature aging. But a cure could do more than just help people who are already infected. It could mean that if there are many more people like Timothy Brown, we would have a better shot at ending the epidemic, because it could slow the spread of the virus from one person to another. And this is just to show you that in Chicago, we're not unique. This is a map from the CDC that shows that around the country, the dark areas are the areas with the highest rates of infection in 20 to 24-year-olds. These are new infections. So what we want to do is cure people, starting with the young people, but this is going to help everybody, young or old, black or white, gay or straight, rich or poor, whatever neighborhood you live in. If the total number of people living with HIV goes down, the chance of the virus spreading will go down. And the problem that we have now is it's simple, but it's also very hard to fix. Condoms just aren't used all the time, and sometimes they don't work. And sometimes people don't know they're affected. A very large number of people who are infected don't know they're infected, so they don't take as many precautions as maybe they would if they knew they were infected. And in the absence of a cure, people who are on medicines, if they forget to take their medicines, well, then the virus might come back up and might be more likely to spread to their partners. And it's really hard to take pills every day. So this maybe leads you to be asking the question, why does HIV come back when people stop their pills for a short time? Well, HIV is different from infections like strep throat. You take a pill for strep throat long enough so that the last germ stops growing. And that takes a couple weeks. And then you can stop the medicine, and all those germs are dead, and they won't come back. But the medicines that we have that work so well really don't completely stop HIV, because what HIV does is it finds its way into cells that are at rest. These are cells of our immune system where HIV hides, where HIV is also sleeping. The cell is at rest because the cell has been programmed to, after it learns how to recognize a particular germ, it goes to sleep and waits for that germ to come back into your body, and then it wakes up to fight it off. And HIV sleeps with it, but if it wakes up, so does HIV. And then it starts growing again and spreading to other cells. And these cells do encounter germs or pieces of germs commonly. So all it takes is, by chance, a couple of weeks, and one of those cells will encounter a germ and start waking up, and HIV will also wake up and start growing. This is what we call HIV's latent reservoir, and unfortunately, if we don't continue the drugs for life, it will take 2 weeks for the virus to come back. So what we have to try to do is to get rid of all those cells in which the virus is sleeping. Several approaches are being tried. Timothy will tell you his story, but his case is unique because he needed a transplant of someone else's blood cells in order to cure a cancer of his blood cells. And doctors first completely destroyed all his blood cells, and that got rid of all the cells that had sleeping HIV, as well as all his cancer cells. But they also did something really smart. They added a fail-safe in case they missed any cells that had a sleeping HIV in it. They gave him a transplant of cells from another person who had a very rare genetic mutation. Less than 1 in 100 people have this. This mutation blocks the gateway that HIV uses to get into cells. It's not impossible for HIV to get into cells that have this mutation, but it's very, very hard. And HIV specialists would have said, well, this probably won't work, but it did work in Timothy's case. And he was very courageous, and you'll hear why he was so courageous. This type of transplant requires weakening his immune defenses so he doesn't reject the foreign person's cells, and this put him at risk for death, infections, and many other problems. It's a long, tough, very expensive procedure. It requires a long time in the hospital. So since this happened, Timothy has inspired literally thousands of scientists around the world to figure out a way to do this that's less risky and less difficult. So one thing people are trying is to take cells out of the body of an HIV-infected person and try to destroy that gateway that's on the surface of the blood cells, and then give those modified cells back to people so that they're their own cells, and they wouldn't need to have their immune system weakened so they don't reject the cells. There's a lot of work left for that approach to work, but people are working on it. Another approach is called shock and kill, using a cancer medicine for a little while to wake up the sleeping genes in cells, all sleeping genes, including HIV. But unfortunately, so far, attempts to do this haven't really woken up the sleeping HIV very effectively. And when the sleeping HIV wakes up, the hope would be it would kill that cell, but we find that in fact some of those cells go back to sleep, and so does the HIV. So it may not be the best strategy to get rid of this latent reservoir. And there are worries that the cancer medicine that would need to be used for a short time for the shock and kill approach might have other bad side effects. Another way in which some people with HIV have maybe already been cured is by starting the already available HIV medicines very early. There are a few cases like this that we know about. The Mississippi baby is one. This baby was infected at birth, but medicines were started 30 hours after birth. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the babies stopped getting medicines after about a year, and actually after about 18 months of treatment. And now the baby's almost 2 years out off of the medicines, and the virus hasn't come back. We're calling this a sustained remission. We need to wait longer to see if it's really a cure, as we call Timothy a cure. And there are also about a dozen adults in Europe who had HIV medicine started within the first 6 months after they caught HIV, and they also appear to be in a sustained remission for a couple of years. So we really will be talking tomorrow at a scientific workshop at Northwestern with all of the scientists from around the world who are doing this kind of research to put our heads together to try to figure out how to make this really happen for more people. And we also are going to be talking with social scientists and behavioral scientists to try to link ways to better prevent HIV infections with efforts to cure them, so that if someone doesn't effectively get the HIV prevented, if the prevention fails and they get infected, then they will be set up for us to try to do the best we can to start therapy early, give them optimum health, and maybe give them a chance of being in the minority of people who now start the regular medicines early, who might be able to stop them and not have the virus come back. So the ideal strategy, I think, is combining all of these approaches and increasing testing so that people know if they're infected soon instead of waiting for years. And I want to point out again that the planning committee, all those organizations I mentioned at the start, will keep working together on this, and with CDPH helping us, I think with years more work, with the community behind us, we will have a chance to have more people join Timothy. But right now, Timothy is the living, breathing, talking proof that a cure can be accomplished. And I believe that every young person and every parent can learn more, and that having more awareness about HIV will help us all work together to eventually end the epidemic in Chicago, and we can be a model for the rest of the world. I urge you to have the same kind of hope and courage that Timothy had, and let's hope that in the future this really will be only the start. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. D'Aquila. And I just want to remind people that Dr. Choucair and D'Aquila gave us a lot of information, and you probably have questions on it. So I want to remind people that you can fill out an index card like this. There will be people walking the aisles to collect them from you, and you can write down a question on them, and we'll be able to ask them questions afterwards. Also, you can send a text message if you prefer to do that, and I'll give you the phone number right now if you've got a question on anything that's said. The number is 773-599-3409. Once again, that's 773-599-3409. And you can text your questions there, and we'll get to them at the end. Moving on, now we're going to talk about our featured guest here today, Timothy Ray Brown. He's joining us from his home base in Nevada. He made international and national headlines as the Berlin patient, a pseudonym he received when it was discovered that he was cured of the HIV virus as a result of a bone marrow stem cell transplant he underwent for the treatment of leukemia. Just amazing. The treatment, which took place in 2007 and 2008, eliminated traces of HIV in his body and made him a miracle patient in the fight against HIV. Currently, Timothy serves as the founder of the Timothy Ray Brown Foundation and the World AIDS Institute, both of which aim to promote awareness as well as reduce the shame traditionally associated with the HIV positive status. And most importantly, support the finding an HIV cure that's accessible to everybody. Please welcome our featured guest, Timothy Ray Brown.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to thank the Northwestern University, the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, and the other organizations and agencies that have participated. I was diagnosed with HIV in 1995, and at that point there was only AZT as a possible treatment. I told my treating doctor that I didn't want to take AZT because I had heard a lot of people died from the medication. And so she kind of forced me pretty much to start taking a low dose of AZT. She didn't really force me. She suggested strongly that I do so. So I started taking AZT, and I didn't really have, since I was taking such a low dose, I didn't really have totally negative effects from it. Luckily, the next year in 1996, new medications started coming out onto the market, and so I was able to start taking those. I think I started with a dual combination at first. I can't remember what the classification of the medications were. I can't remember the names of them. I don't really think about HIV medication anymore because I don't have to take it. So anyway, I did fairly well. I didn't actually give up my life. A good friend of mine told me, the friend of mine that actually said I should get tested told me that, you know, we actually probably only have about 2 more years to live. And that was a big shock. I was like, really? But I kind of went on with life as I had done before, and I had started studying in Berlin, and I decided to continue with that. So I did, and I eventually, I was working in a restaurant and working. I was going to school full-time and working pretty much full-time. And then I started translating from German to English, and that became my job. And at first I was working as a freelance translator, and then they hired me as one of their only, like 3 employees that they had. So I was doing very well there, and then I went to a wedding, a gay wedding a commitment ceremony in New York City, and I got there and I was very tired the whole time, and I thought I might have jet lag. The person I was staying with was going online, trying to pick up people online, and he was doing that right next to where I was sleeping, and it was keeping me awake. So I thought maybe that was the reason why I was so tired. Anyway, I didn't participate in his activities. Not that I'm against that. So anyway, then I went back to Berlin and went back to work on Monday, and on the way, it took me longer than usual. It was about a 10-mile bike ride to get there, and I could usually do that in less than an hour. But this time it took me a lot longer than usual it took, and I was like 5 minutes late for work, and my boss got pissed off at me. And I said, well, I'm really tired, and I've been tired the whole time I was gone, and I'm really sorry. And then at lunchtime, I rode my bike. I was going to ride my bike to an Indian restaurant nearby, and halfway there, I had to get off my bike, and I called my very kind, loving partner, Michelle, and said, Michelle, I need to see a doctor. I told you I was tired and all the time during the trip, and I really need to see a doctor. And I don't know if I can keep going to get to the place I want to eat lunch. And I actually walked my bike to that place. And he called my doctor, and my doctor didn't have any appointments available. And so he ended up calling his HIV doctor. He was also HIV positive. And his doctor said, yeah, okay, come in tomorrow. And so I went in the next day, and I found out they did a blood test, and my red blood cell count was very low. And so I needed to get transfusions to replace the blood cells. So I got a transfusion. I think they gave me 2 liters of blood, and so the values went up, and then the next day I went in and they had fallen again, back to where they'd been. So they did that for a few days, and finally the doctor said, I don't think this is working. I think I need to send you to an oncologist. So I went to the oncologist the next day, and he started out by telling me, my gut feeling tells me you don't have anything serious like leukemia or lymphoma or whatever, like no blood diseases, severe blood diseases. But he, to be on the safe side, he decided to give me a what's called a bone marrow biopsy. They stick a needle into your back, like back here, and they sometimes numb it. Actually, they used to do numb it. They sometimes put you under for it. In this case, I think they just numbed it. He just numbed it, and he uses the plunger to suck out the bone marrow from your backside, and it hurts like hell. It's like one of the most painful things I've ever experienced. So, and I had to get several of those later on. It's the best way to test to see if you've got what's called blasts, meaning leukemic cells in your blood. And so that was on a Friday, and then I went back on Monday and expected him to be like he'd always been, happy and give me good news. And he said, I have bad news for you. You've got acute myeloid leukemia. And that was, of course, was a huge shock. It was actually worse than getting the HIV diagnosis, because I knew that I found out very quickly that if it wasn't treated, I was going to die, like within months. And I told, my partner had stayed in the car, and I went out to the car and told him. I kind of walked slowly to the car, and was like, I've got really bad news. I've got leukemia. And he started crying. In fact, he cried over it much more than I did. I didn't really usually cry about things that concerned me. I was kind of blocked off from my own emotions, I guess. So he really cried, and I remember he called his sister and said, Tim has leukemia, and she said she didn't believe it, and He's like, really, she thought he was playing a joke on her. Anyway, so yeah. Oh, and before I went to the car, I asked the doctor if, he said you're going to need to get, you're going to need to go to the hospital and get chemotherapy to get rid of the leukemia. And so, excuse me, can I have a bottle of water, please? Sorry about that. So I was afraid of stigma because that's really big, a big fear and actually a big cause of suicide among people that have HIV. I didn't feel I was suicidal at all, but I didn't want to deal with people in the hospital judging me. And in fact, my partner had ended up in the hospital in a town or city south of Berlin called Halle. He overheard one of the nurses say, "Be careful of that patient, he's got AIDS," really loud. And basically, so everybody on the station could hear, on the ward could hear. So anyway, the doctor said, "Okay, I think you should probably go to a university hospital because they're probably going to be less likely to judge you." And so he ended up calling the ward at the hospital, and he happened to get Dr. Gerhuter on the phone. Gerhuter would become important later because he was the one that came up with the idea for my cure. So he called up and he said, "I have this patient, he's got leukemia, acute myeloid leukemia, and he needs to be treated." And Dr. Huter said, "Okay, send him over." So I found out one day that I had leukemia. The next day I was in the hospital, in the university hospital, and having 4 tubes put into my neck, which led down to my heart, and getting chemotherapy. And I originally thought when the oncologist told me that I had to get chemotherapy that I'd do it for a week and go home, and that would be it, and leukemia would be cured. I found out that I had to do 4 rounds of that. I was supposed to have to do 4 rounds of that. In the end, I actually didn't do that, but I'll tell the rest later. So anyway, I was there in the hospital, and I took an exercise mat because I thought, okay, I'll spend this time keeping fit and trying to stay healthy that way. So I did a week of that, and got done with that, and thought, okay, it's over. And then I found out that I was going to have a few weeks break, and I would have to go back, and I would have to wait until there was a bed available and have to go back and do it again. And actually I'd have to do it 4 times. And that was kind of a big shock to me. So I went in and did the second round of chemo, and I ended up getting an infection, a fungal infection, which made my neck swell up because of the tubes that were sticking out of it. And this is kind of gross. So anyway, and they had to put the tubes in the other side, so that meant doing the procedure again to get the tubes into my heart. So then, during the 3rd round of chemo, halfway through, I developed this sepsis infection, a blood bacterial infection, and had to be put into an induced coma. I was breathing heavily, my blood pressure dropped quite a bit, and I had a very high fever. And so I was put into this coma, and I woke up, and I was looking up at the doctor, or I didn't know he was the doctor. I thought it was the Grim Reaper. And I was like, oh my God, I'm dead. But then I figured out I wasn't dead. So anyway, I asked Dr. Choucair when I saw him next, so what's next? Am I going to continue this round of chemo? Are you going to keep feeding me with these poisons? Or, and he said, I don't know what we should do. And he said, do you have any place that you like to go a lot on vacation? And I said, yeah, I love Italy. And so it was arranged that about 5 days later I left for Italy. And I spent about 3 weeks there and had a wonderful time and could forget about what had been in the past and could forget that I had this horrible illness. And then I went back to Berlin and went back to the outpatient clinic, and they did another bone marrow biopsy and said, okay, your leukemia is in remission. And actually, before the third transplant, Dr. Choucair came to me and said, I want to take your blood, I want to send it to the donor bank. In Germany's got a public health system, like the United States is trying to get. And it's, everybody's insured. You either have a public insurer or a private insurer. All the insurance companies, even the public ones, compete amongst each other, and it's a very good system. There are problems, of course. So anyway, you can pick between private insurers. It's more costly, or public insurers, and they offer different benefits, and you can pick the one with the best benefits. In my case, I chose one called Techniker Krankenkasse, that's insurance, and I ended up, for example, I had the wasting syndrome with HIV, and my cheeks were really hollow, and they actually paid for me to get a fat transplant from my belly to my cheeks. And so that was really nice. Actually, the whole time I was in Germany, I never paid a dime for any medication or anything. It was assumed that I lived there and I was insured, and so I deserved treatment. And they basically paid for anything that had to do with the illness. And that was actually the argument that the plastic surgeon gave to the insurance company in order to get me that treatment. Okay, so back to my story. So I found out my leukemia was in remission, and I had my blood tested, and it was sent to the donor bank in another part of Germany. And so I would ask Dr. Choucair every day, how many hits did you get? Like, how many donors are there? And it ended up that there were actually 267 possible donors, which is actually a huge number. In fact, I knew many people don't have any donors. In fact, I knew a guy who he was Romanian, and he had, I think, another type of leukemia, and he didn't find any donors, and so his mother had to donate for him. And since the match was only half of his tissue type, it didn't work, and his body rejected it, and he actually died, unfortunately. So I was quite lucky that I had so many possible donors. The fact that I had so many donors gave Dr. Choucair, he he was not really he had nothing to do with HIV. He wasn't an HIV doctor. He had studied at university and had heard about something called CCR5 delta 32 mutation, which was explained by Richard. It means that the people that have that are highly resistant to HIV, if not immune. So he decided he was going to have the blood tested of the donors to see if he could find a patient that had the mutation. And I had to go and talk to the professor as well as, well, of course, the Dr. Hugh had to talk to him as well. And he said, this could cost up to €1 million to have this done. And the hospital will have to eat a lot of the costs. I don't know how much it costs, and I don't know how much the hospital had to eat. But anyway, on the 61st try, Dr. Huter had blood tested mostly of the German donors because they were the most available to get. And so on the 61st try, he actually found a hit. And then he said, I found a donor who has this mutation, and I'd like you to get a transplant. And so I talked to my family, I talked to my grandmother, and she's very close to me. My grandfather passed away years before, and I said, what would you do? If I get this transplant, there's a 50% chance that I survive or not. And I think I told her that I have HIV, and it's weird how things happen in my family. Nobody actually says things to each other. They kind of whisper around, and so my grandmother may have known that I was HIV positive. And I said, well, I can keep taking my HIV medication, and it's not really that important to me to be cured of HIV. I can live a pretty normal lifespan, and if I get this transplant, they were trying to put pressure on me even though I was in remission. And Dr. Ruth actually didn't put that much pressure on me. So anyway, and I went to another professor in a different city in Dresden, which is like an hour and a half south of Berlin. And the professor agreed with me that there was really no reason to risk my life in order to get this possible cure of HIV. That was kind of up in the air whether it was or not at that point. Nobody really knew. So that was like in August that I went and saw the professor, and I did pretty well. I kept working. I started going to the gym, getting in good shape, and then sorry. I'm sorry. So anyway, in December, the leukemia came back. And at that point, it was clear that I had to get the transplant. And so it was scheduled, and prior to the transplant, I had to have more chemotherapy. Of course, I was scared to death of that because of what had happened before. I thought, okay, now I'm going to go into have another septic infection, and going to have to go into an induced coma again. Didn't happen. So I had the about a week of chemo and then full body radiation. It took place in an old building in another hospital within the university system, and then it was basically to kill off my own immune system. So I didn't have any immune system. I was in a room with double doors and in a completely blocked off section of the hospital, in a ward that was completely blocked off, to prevent germs spreading, because it could be very dangerous for all the patients there. And so prior to the transplant, I knew the date of the transplant, the date it was supposed to happen. The irradiation happened one day before the transplant, and I was scared to death that something would happen and the donor wouldn't be able to get to Germany. And then I found out that he had given the stem cells, and they were in Cologne. And so somebody had to go to Cologne and pick up the stem cells and bring them to me, so I could get them. There's confusion between bone marrow transplant and stem cell transplant. Bone marrow transplant, they used to actually have to cut the body open and open up the bones and scrape out the stem cells and graft them onto the bones of the patient. So both the donor and the patient had to undergo invasive surgery. A stem cell transplant is quite easy. They give him medication, which I heard last night was cancer.
It was developed for
HIV. Yeah, it was developed for HIV.
It didn't work for HIV.
It didn't work, and so it didn't have anything really to do with leukemia, and but they found out that it would actually release stem cells into the blood, and so the blood is then filtered so that stem cells that come out, and those can be given to the patient. So anyway, it arrived. Nothing happened. No, the train didn't crash or anything like that. So it was like getting a transfusion. I had the tubes in my neck still because of the chemo, and I actually went to my birthday party with tubes hanging out of my neck. So I got the transplant, and then there's a recovery period that's normally about 13 days. In my case, it went quite quickly. I think it was the stem cells started to reproduce, and so I had a new immune system from the donor. I'm not me. I'm actually the donor. I'm actually German now. I could dance very well before. I can't dance as well now. That's the stereotype. It's not true, really true. My recovery from that transplant was very good. I didn't have HIV anymore, and so I started to gain weight because I had what was called the wasting syndrome, which many people had in the early days. And in fact, I had it even though I had good medication. The medication's definitely improved. So I started gaining weight. I went to the gym. I went back to the gym and started to look good. It was actually, for the first time in my life, I liked my body. and I went back to work. They actually let me go back to work. My brain was actually okay then. It still is. So, yeah, and then, so I found out later that 3 months later I didn't have any more HIV in my body. Oh, a really important thing, and this is very important, I quit taking my HIV medication on the day of my transplant. It actually wasn't protocol that I do so, but my loving partner, Michelle, said, I think you need to quit taking your medication, because if you don't, the stem cells won't reproduce and you won't have an immune system and you'll die. And of course this was a new field because they'd never transplanted somebody with HIV before, so they didn't really know what would happen. And Dr. Choucair said, you have to keep taking your medication, it's in the protocol. And I said, okay, I'm not going to do the transplant. And he said, okay. And he had a meeting with his colleagues, and he came back and, the next morning I had the protocol, the new protocol. And it basically said I was supposed to stop taking medication that morning. So I quit taking the medication, the HIV medication, that day, and have never taken it since. It's pretty amazing. Unfortunately, at the end of the year, the leukemia came back. I had to get another one of those horrible things, and it actually had come back, and so it meant that I had to get a second transplant. And they started. They said, we don't really want to have to give you a new transplant, so they started trying other things, like a different chemotherapy, which was taking pills, and that didn't work. And then they tried to give me leukocytes, which are a portion of the white blood cells, to try to stimulate my own leukocytes, and that didn't work. And so it became clear that I had to get a second transplant. And then, of course, the question was, will the donor actually agree to give this patient a second transplant? And luckily he did. And so I got the first transplant in February of 2007, which cured me of HIV, and that's why this is the 7th anniversary of my cure. But I had to get the second transplant in February of 2008. And the second transplant didn't go quite as well. It took longer to get out of the hospital, and then I was in and out of the hospital for about a period of a year. And I developed delirium, and ended up having to be put into, sent to a different hospital and put into a center for patients with severe brain injuries. And so when I got there, there was a physical therapist, not the best physical therapist there, but an assistant. She asked me to move my left leg, and I moved my right leg because I couldn't tell the difference anymore. But then, I got up I could finally be put into a wheelchair and move the wheelchair around. And that was quite an experience. I kind of liked wheelchairs before, but I hate them now. Because they're hard to maneuver. Like, you want to turn a corner, and turning a wheelchair is very difficult. They finally got me out of the wheelchair and walking with a walker. This is over a period of several weeks. And then I graduated from the walker to actually walking, very slowly, of course. A good friend of mine who is from Seattle, where I'm from, who now lives in Washington, D.C., had come to visit me, and she had told friends that she was going to make peace with me, like say goodbye to me. And she got there, and she was there for a couple weeks, and so she would witness me with the walker, and then witness me walking, and so I was able to walk again. And oh, and of course she didn't see me die, which was nice. So it took me, I had to go to a rehab center in basically east of Berlin, and so that took another month. So I went from the Center for People with Severe Brain Injuries to a rehab center, and Michel told me that he didn't think I was strong enough to actually release my name to anyone. Up to that point, there was talk in the medical community that there was a patient who was cured of HIV. And at that point, nobody really believed it. In fact, doctors in Berlin and Germany didn't believe it. And of course, there's great infighting between the people in the medical profession in Germany. Like people, the hospitals are basically very hierarchical, and so anyway, about the middle of 2010, I decided I was going to release my name to the media, and so I agreed to do an interview with a magazine called Stern, which is kind of like the Germany Newsweek, and release my name and my image. So I went from, my goal was basically to go from being the Berlin patient to being Timothy Ray Brown, and people would know who I was, the image. The reason I decided to do this was because I felt like I needed to give back to the HIV community. My heart was definitely with the HIV community, as it is now. That was when I became Timothy Ray Brown, not just the Berlin patient. So I continued to recover, and eventually started going back to the gym and getting in good shape, and so here I am, and I will not rest until everyone who has HIV is cured. And I believe that a cure will come within my lifetime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy Brown. Now, before we get to our next speaker, I just want to remind people once again to fill out those index cards with any questions you have for Timothy or any of the doctors who spoke, or even our next speaker. Or you could, of course, send a text message, and the number is actually up on the screen. Okay? All right, we're going to welcome to the stage right now Peter McLoyd, who is the Consumer Development and Advocacy Coordinator at the Ruth Rothstein Core Center, which is a part of the Cook County Health and Hospital Systems and serves more than 5,000 individuals living with HIV/AIDS. So I'm going to invite Mr. McLoyd to the stage right now.
So thank you. I will be brief. First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me tonight to tonight's events and being part of the panel. It's a great opportunity to meet Timothy and Dr. Akila. Having lived with HIV for over 20 years myself, and for being on treatment the last 17 years, I'm inspired by Timothy's story and honored to have the opportunity to meet him tonight. Your story and a few others in the news recently gives me hope that every moment we get closer to a day when we can truly say the title of AIDS-free generation is here. Like most people living with HIV/AIDS, I am a supporter of the ongoing research efforts to seek a functional cure. I'm thankful for the work and dedication of researchers like Dr. Akila. Thank you very much for all that you're doing. And as I grow older and have to deal with the realities of not only managing HIV, but also having to manage a number of other chronic conditions related to the aging process, the idea of scratching HIV off the list is obviously very appealing to me. But even if a cure is not found in my lifetime, I recognize that this work is important for the 36 million people around the world living with HIV, as well as those who are living in places and in situations that put them at risk in a direct path of HIV infection. The search for a cure should be important for all of us. That being said, I think there's a critical need for those of us working on HIV's front lines, whether it's treatment, prevention, research, or policy and advocacy, to take a moment and consider pathways that lessen the daunting realities of competing priorities and limited funding. Why are we still so siloed in our areas of interest and focus, feeling that the area that we focus on should take precedence over other areas of HIV? A good start for us breaking down those silos might be coming together for a moment and thinking about bringing thought leaders together, just starting in the United States, to engage in a conversation about how can we collectively end this epidemic rather than always competing for limited resources. Leaders from all sectors coming together to seek some agreement on a path towards what we all hope will be an AIDS-free generation, an AIDS-free world. Making decisions about limited dollars. Some might think that's pie in the sky. You're probably right, but it's still my dream. Some people will say it can never happen. But just for a moment, we should consider the possibility of community priority setting process that minimize the ongoing competition for limited resources. Everything around HIV is important. Timothy's story shows that there's a path forward for ending the epidemic. Let's encourage the thought leaders, experts, and people living with HIV to come together as one to agree on national priorities and equitable funding to finally end the epidemic. Thank you.
At this point, Mr. McLoyd is going to stay on stage, and I'm going to invite Dr. Akila and Timothy to our stage as well, and we are going to do some question answer.
Thank you guys all for your words today. It's just amazing. I'll start with Timothy, just because you were a featured speaker, and honestly, learning more about you is truly amazing to me. On a personal note, my uncle died of AIDS in the late 80s. So my image of it is much different than what it is today. Still, meeting you, and you told me you're cured of HIV, I'm like, what? Really? What? I'm still kind of wrapping my mind around it. Do you find that that's the case when you're talking about being cured with other people? What is the reaction that you get?
In the case that I meet people and they don't know my story, they're kind of like, really? And there are still a lot of people that have never heard of my story, and so.
Do they believe you?
I'm not sure. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Yeah.
Because the recent stories in the news with the infants who were supposedly cured of HIV, you know, it's still just so unbelievable.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, I think that there's a lot of confusion of what a cure is and who's actually cured, because it's still, even today, the word's thrown around a lot, and nobody's really sure.
First question I get is still on, really, are you cured? And what does that mean? Can you still transmit HIV to other people?
I don't have any virus in me or in my blood, and probably, I'm sure, not in my semen. I have undergone countless biopsies. In fact, I had a brain biopsy because HIV hides in the brain, and they told me that they thought maybe there might be leukemia in my brain, because I was delirious at that point, and they were trying to figure out why. But they also tested for HIV, and there was no HIV in my brain. I've had so much blood taken that probably every, well, Richard said that he doesn't have any in my blood, but pretty much
tried to get some.
Oh, really? I was actually at the International AIDS Conference in DC in July of 2012. This one researcher said, this researcher from Amsterdam said, I know you intimately. I'm like, what? Yeah. And he's actually straight, and he's got a wife and kids. He said, yeah, I've got 7,000 copies of your blood in my freezer.
Cortney,
yes.
If I could interject,
Sure.
I know many of the scientists that have studied Timothy's blood and other tissues, and I was just at a meeting 3 weeks ago, and the consensus of all of these very sophisticated researchers is that there are traces that pop up of HIV in some specimens now and then, but that is most likely a result of laboratory errors that just do happen at a very low frequency. And right now, people in the scientific community think that because he's been off HIV medicines for so long, for 7 years, if there really was any chance that the virus was going to come back, it would have happened by now. So he is considered cured, and whenever you read in the scientific reports that they found a trace of HIV, it is really, really a tiny trace.
And usually dead.
And usually dead. And Peter used the term functional cure. What that means is we are able to accept a cure as meaning there's still traces of HIV, but they're dead HIVs, because we'll never get rid of all of the dead remnants of HIV.
And I don't want my body cut into slices and to dissect everything and put it under a microscope or whatever they use.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, Doctor, just a question kind of on that note, and then Peter, you can chime in on this too. How does the advancements in this, for example, Timothy's case being cured of HIV, how does that pose a challenge to you moving forward with educating people on prevention? are people saying, well, there's a cure for HIV, you know, I don't have to be as careful?
Well, it's already a challenge with having very effective treatments for HIV. I think Peter probably deals with this a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a treatment even in populations that know they're at high risk for HIV because they see their neighbors, their friends, their partners who've been living with HIV for many years, who are on treatment, who are doing well, who are active, who are working. And so I think in many cases it doesn't seem as real or as serious to them as it once was.
If I could, you know, what HIV doctors say in private is we're victims of our own success.
Yes.
You know, there are magazines now where you see these advertisements for the medicines with these beautiful, fit, athletic people climbing mountains, riding bikes because they're on their HIV medicines and they're totally healthy. So the image that creates in young people is, oh, it's no big deal. It's quite different than the 80s where, you know, we knew friends and family who were dying and who
It was a death sentence.
wasted. And,
Yeah. A quick one.
It's very different now, and it's a big image problem that we really need to fix.
I wanted to ask you, part of your presentation, you said African American men are at the greatest risk here in the Chicago area. Why is that?
Well, we have part of the answer to that, not the complete answer. There have been a lot of studies in Chicago and lots of places around the country where researchers have interviewed people who are either at risk for HIV or who have HIV, looking for what's different among African Americans versus whites. And of course, the theory that they're testing is that, well, maybe there's more unsafe sex or unsafe drug injection practices among African Americans. But every study has not found that. In fact, many of the studies find that there are more safe practices among the African Americans than the whites.
And you're talking about African American male population?
Yes.
Who,
Yes.
Okay.
I
Just,
am. But
okay,
I think,
narrow that down.
Yeah, and so this leads to the explanation that what's really going on, and some of my colleagues who are in the audience have done some of this research, what's really going on is African Americans are more likely to be in contact with partners who are already HIV infected because the prevalence of HIV is higher, the frequency of HIV is higher in African American communities. Now, I say this is only a partial answer because it doesn't explain how it got that way. But right now, it does explain why it's more likely for the same risk that an African American man will get infected compared to a white man. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's it. And it's, you know, we see certainly a rise in cases among young African American gay men and bisexual men. And I think part of it is that they tend to socialize together and live close to each other and interact with each other. So there are areas in, you know, parts of the city where young African American men live and congregate, where the rates of HIV are probably, you know, mirror that of, you know, some countries in Africa.
That was
That's
the map I showed.
yeah.
And, you know, the short answer is segregation explains these disparities.
A question for you, doctor, that came from the audience. Is there a critical period during infection for a cure that would most likely succeed?
We're still doing research on that, but there are some studies that suggest there's what we call a restorative window that ends between 4 and 6 months after the virus first gets into the body. During that time, the body actually has very strong defenses for that first 4 to 6 month period, and it can rejuvenate and restore a lot of the damage that HIV does very, very quickly. But then, you know, after the immune system builds itself back up, between like month 1 and month 6, then it starts slowly getting destroyed again. So that's why 4 to 6 months may be the critical window where if we can intervene then, we can keep those defenses strong.
Now, are you finding that people are even knowing that they have it in that window?
No, that's the problem, because most commonly there are no symptoms. It is sometimes the case that people will have sort of non-specific symptoms, a fever, a rash, you know, they feel like maybe they got a cold. So that's why it's really now recommended that people who are at high risk should be tested frequently, 2 to 3 times a year, so that we can then potentially catch these infections early enough to do the best we possibly can for them.
Will people who are cured of HIV, such as Timothy, experience that premature aging that you talked about?
Well, we don't have enough of a sample size to know. But the theory is that what causes that premature aging is all that excess inflammation because the body's trying to fight off HIV. And if the body was able to just get rid of the HIV, and the medicines don't completely get rid of it, if we could get rid of it, then the body wouldn't need to be in hyperdrive and we wouldn't have these aging problems.
And I'm very healthy. I stay in shape and I stay healthy and eat well, and I'm what I call a pescatarian. Okay. I eat fish and seafood and vegetables and fruit, of course. And it's basically helped my aging, I think.
Yeah.
I'm 48, so I'm near 50, so.
How far away are we from making the treatment that Timothy got widespread, accessible to people here?
I'm not going to give you an exact number, but I think we all hope it's between 5 and 10 years. But there's a lot of work yet to be done, and I don't think anybody would want what Timothy described. They would want something that was less likely to cause severe problems. I mean, as you've heard, Timothy has had some severe consequences of this treatment. And he was in the hospital for a tremendous amount of time. Almost a year.
I think we have to also increase the amount of resources that NIH, which is a primary, funder of HIV research, is extending toward a cure. In preparation for tonight, I looked and I saw that the NIH budget, the cure research budget is 3% NIH dollars. And, with what we've learned from Timothy's case and the kid and child in Mississippi, I think 3% is dreadfully underfunded for a cure.
And I'll drill down a little bit more into that number. Most of the funding that's going to cure research now is going towards that shock and kill strategy that I described, which seemed to have promise and seemed like it might be less toxic, less dangerous than what Timothy went through 2 years ago. But we've gotten a lot of results now that suggest it may not be the most effective way to go. So I'm very much in favor of having the NIH diversify their portfolio and start spending money on multiple different ways to try to cure HIV rather than putting all of its eggs in that shock and kill basket.
What is your advice to young people who just found out that they're HIV positive?
Well, find out if you think you're at risk, go get tested. And if you test positive, get into care. And then the big problem that Dr. Choucair told us is we got to get people to stay in care. And if they can stay in care and stay on medicines, they will stay healthier for longer, and they will be around when we do finally get the answers for how to cure people.
And why is there that challenge in staying in care?
I think it's multiple challenges. I think that, you know, people have competing priorities, and, you know, when people become HIV positive, they might feel just perfectly healthy, and when people feel healthy, they don't seek treatment. I think in the cases of African Americans and Latinos, and particularly that are living in areas where there wasn't resources, and before ACA, it just, you know, they just didn't know how to really, you know, engage in the healthcare system in the most efficient way.
And I think stigma is a big problem still. It's better than it was in the 80s, but it's still the case. People don't want to have medicines in their medicine chest that a family member or a friend is going to see. People are very reluctant to this day to disclose if they're HIV positive. And so that makes it very hard to, you know, take a medicine every single day if, you know, you go on vacation
right.
or you visit family or friends, you have to take your medicine with you and you have to try to hide it. So, you know, it's a big issue.
So how do you work to fight that stigma while still still making sure that people know there's an urgency? It's a very serious disease.
It's one of our toughest challenges, I think. You know, we still hear about young African American gay men who become HIV infected, who are disowned by their families and end up, you know, being at even higher risk for, you know, all kinds of issues because they are no longer welcome in home. And you know, it's just, it's amazing the amount of stigma, I think, that really is harming young African American and Latino gay men in our communities, you know, not only from society in general, but from their families. And I think until we get to a place where we recognize that, you know, a person's sexuality does not define them, you know, people should be treated based on their sexuality, that, you know, we got a long way to go in that type of stigma and discrimination that's related to a sexual identity.
And I actually have some hope that once people really understand that young people are now at increasing risk, that, you know, parents will care about their kids and about their neighbors' kids and about our community's kids. It's our future. And I think if we can generate enough of a message that we need to do the best we can for our next generation, maybe there's going to be a better chance of staying in AIDS for a generation.
I have more questions from the audience. One is, can Timothy's blood/stem cells now be used to cure others?
No.
Okay.
That's a simple answer.
I can't even donate because I've had cancer, and because of that, I can't even donate for another stem cell.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the real risk, not the HIV,
Right, yeah.
just in case there's cancer.
Yeah.
Okay. Can a person with HIV participate in medical studies for a universal cure of HIV?
I'm sorry.
Can a person with HIV participate in medical studies?
Yes.
And how is that? How is that done?
Very much. And, you know, that would help this research and all kinds of HIV research, to address Peter's point. We really need to have more people participate in research. It's still true that there are fewer young people in research than older people. There are fewer African Americans in research than whites. There are fewer women than men. So we really can only learn what we need to know about HIV if we can have a representative sample of the people who have HIV. That means we really need more young people, more African Americans, and more women to participate in HIV research.
And, you know, we have not, this country and the whole world has not always had the most ethical practices around research. So I think that, you know, it's a lot better than it has been, but, you know, there's still a lot of trust issues with minorities, African Americans, Latinos, with engaging in research because of things that they've heard. So.
Well, and those fears are well warranted. I mean, Tuskegee was not that long ago. And, you know, we still have to live down that history and correct that terrible mistake.
You touched on this before, but would Tim's experimental treatment have occurred in the U.S.?
No, for a couple reasons. You know, Tim talked about the funding for healthcare being very different. And the other reason that's probably even more pertinent is Dr. Hooter, the oncologist who came up with this idea, was thinking very far outside the box. In the US, an HIV specialist would have said to the oncologist, "That's the craziest thing I ever heard of. It won't work. Don't even try it."
Well, they told him that in Germany too. In fact, the professor thought it was crazy, but he decided to go ahead and have it funded to get it done. So, yeah.
I would like to point out that since Timothy's procedure, there have been efforts throughout the world to find other HIV-infected people who had cancers that needed transplantation, and to try the same approach, getting those CCR5 Delta 32 cells to use for transplant. There was one attempt in St. Louis, and unfortunately the person who received that transplant died from the procedure. But doctors now are looking for an opportunity to try to repeat what happened to Timothy, but it really has to be for someone who's otherwise almost certainly going to die because the risk is so great.
And it might be a tough sell for researchers to engage people living with HIV who are on therapy, who are doing very well, about stopping their therapy in order to get engaged in cure research. So we had a situation here a couple of summers ago where a research company came in and engaged some political leaders to kind of like push a study down the throats of the community, and I think that created a backlash and some distrust. And so we, there's, just issues around trust. And
so kind of what you were saying, a victim of your own success in treatment. People are doing so well now.
Yeah,
it's not that.
That's right.
And if you participate in the study, it doesn't mean you're going to be cured. It's just basically to help other people. Probably wouldn't help you because many of these attempts to find cures are not successful.
In fact, I think that may be an argument in favor for doing cure research very early after people get infected.
Yeah.
Because right now we don't routinely start medicines right away. We're sort of moving in that direction. But we wait a little while. So if we started treatment very early and we gave medicines for a year or two and then we stopped them to see if the virus came back or not, we probably wouldn't be doing terrible harm if the virus did come back and then we put the patient back on medicines. They'd still be able to take medicines for the rest of their life. It wouldn't impair the benefits of taking medicines.
Mr. McLoyd, we heard a lot about Timothy's story, but tell us about your story in terms of coping with HIV and telling your family, and how has that been for you?
Well, I'm a recovering addict. I started injecting heroin when I was 18 years old, and I did that, all through my 20s and up until I started getting sick and around about the time that HIV came out in the early 80s. It had gotten so to a point where in 1997 I had to be hospitalized, and at that point I had been HIV positive for so long that it had developed into AIDS. So I had PCP pneumonia, I had thrush, I had something called hairy leukoplakia. I was wasting, I was a mess. And I was hospitalized at the old Cook County Hospital, and peer educators came to visit me, nurses came to visit me. They told me about the new medications that had just came out in the last couple of years, and that there was hope. And I believe that. I believe that if I, really got into care and stayed engaged in care, got some support for my substance abuse issues, that there was hope. And interestingly enough, the night that I was hospitalized at the old Cook County Hospital, and my wife always gets a little embarrassed when I tell this story, but I've got to tell it, baby. I was so strung out on heroin that they put me in an isolation room at County Hospital, and the doctors were going in and out, and they were like, wow, this guy, he's really, really sick. And in between their visits, I was going to the bathroom and shooting dope. And that,
wow.
That's how bad I was, and I could just, they didn't tell me how sick I was, but I had a pretty good impression that I was very sick when I went to a county emergency room, and I actually was seen at a health department clinic, and they gave me all this paperwork, said you need to go right to the county's emergency room. And within 15 minutes of being registered, I was in an exam room. So that was a pretty good indication that something serious was going on. But, the good news is that, even though I was so strung out that I was shooting dope in the exam room, sorry, baby, that night, that was the last time I got high. That was the last time I used drugs. I got treatment, I got care. And, it was, the care was outstanding, the support was outstanding. I was, got all the services that I needed. And I decided early on that I wanted to really, focus the rest of my life on working with people living with HIV and doing all I can to bringing this epidemic to an end.
And we thank you.
And thank you.
Okay, I'm told I have to get the last two questions in. Okay. Do you think the risks of a stem cell transplant and chemo justify using this as a cure for HIV given increasing safety of HIV meds? We kind of touched on this before a little bit.
No, it doesn't.
At this point it doesn't, but you're hoping to...
It's a proof of concept. It tells us that it's possible to get rid of HIV, but it's not the way we want to do it. We have to find a better way.
This question is for everybody. What would you say to HIV patients who are scared of participating in research?
I would say don't be afraid. I would say that, we've gone a long way from Tuskegee. There's all types of things in place to protect patients' rights. I think that, have a conversation with the researchers at your institution, wherever it is, about the risk and benefits of being involved in whatever type of study it is. Talk to your provider, talk to your peers. And, if it's something that you think is going to be good for you, or if you feel just feeling very altruistic about maybe this is going to be good for the community, then go for it.
Yeah, I would say pretty much the same thing. There are probably real studies that will benefit an individual. And I think the most important thing is to get information and find out, what kinds of studies are going on. It's great if you can be altruistic, but, realistically, a lot of the studies are now designed so that a patient might get something that is, 6 months or a year away from being available in the drugstore that might really help them. And it might be something that, if they don't get it in 6 months, there'll be more harm. So just get information, talk to a lot of people, particularly peer educators, people that you can trust, and make an informed decision that, often by helping science, you're really going to be helping yourself.
Timothy, I wanted to just throw a last question at you real quick. Okay. You've probably identified as a person who has HIV or a patient for a long time. Yes. How do you identify now?
I basically say I'm negative, but I have a very strong tie to the HIV community. many of my friends are HIV positive. My boyfriend's HIV positive. He's been positive for 25 years, and I really care about the community. And I basically say it kind of depends on the length that I want the conversation to be. Because if I tell too much, then they'll want to know more and more and more.
Right.
So yeah, sometimes I tell people, sometimes I don't. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers, Timothy Brown, for being here, Dr.